Hey guys, and welcome back to Betwixt the Books. It's Michaela here. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2026. I am here to talk about my best and worst reads of 2025. Gretchen did hers earlier this week, so if you missed that, go watch her talk about hers. But if you're here for me, welcome. I'm here to talk about some of my favorite reads and some of the more disappointing reads of last year. I wound up having 7 5-star reads throughout the year, um, 2 of which from the same author, which is funny, so I'll lump them both together here. 4 of them were backlist titles from my shelves that I picked off during my Rainbow Reading Challenge, and then 3 were new releases from this year that I picked up along the way. A lot of these I've talked about in videos, whether they are reading roundtables or dedicated videos. If they are part of that, I'll try and link them up above. I'm going to go through them in the order that I read them, so they're not ranked in any particular way. All of these are great. If one of them sounds good to you, I highly recommend it. I'm not going to pit any one over the other, really. So all of these are top tier reads from me in particular. The first book I read that I rated 5 stars was The Lamplighters by Emma Stonix. I picked this one up back in January. It was one of the pink books off my shelves. This was one that I had ordered specifically the UK edition because the cover in the UK was just so much better than the American edition. I'll pop up pictures probably on the screen when I'm editing this, but that one is perhaps the most surprising book to hit this list. Not because I didn't think I was going to like it, I wouldn't have picked it up if I didn't think I was going to like it, but because it is historical fiction, which I don't traditionally reach for the most part. I'm not a person who loves historical fiction, and more often than not I'm avoiding it because I don't like war books, but this is not a war book, which is probably why I enjoyed it. It follows sort of 2 timelines, the first one being 3 men who are lighthouse keepers who are staying within a lighthouse. Something happens during their stay where all 3 of them essentially disappear. And then you are also following a timeline that's, I think, 20 years later or something like that, which is all of the women that those men left behind. There is a person in that timeline that's going around trying to figure out what happened to the men at the lighthouse by interviewing these women, and you slowly unravel the intricacies of their lives and the different ways that everybody is interconnected. You don't necessarily figure out what actually happened to the men. There is a little bit of a magical realism element to this one, which I always enjoy, but I know not everybody else does. But if you like a little bit of a closed door mystery tucked into your historical fiction, as well as an interesting take on the ways that these people who were very isolated, because they're literally locked on an island with each other, for days, months, weeks at a time, the ways that their interpersonal problems sort of overlap and interact with what may or may not have happened to these men. This was apparently based off of a real story that the author had heard about people going missing at a lighthouse, and it was interesting. I really enjoyed it. So even if you aren't a historical fiction person, I recommend picking it up, because yeah, I'm not usually, and I loved it. The next book that I read that I really loved was Our Wives Under the Sea by Julie Armfield. I believe I talked about this one in a reading roundtable. Again, 5 stars. These are all my 5-star reads of the year. So that one is a queer story that follows 2 women, again, 2 timelines, interesting. One where one of the women in this group has gone onto a submarine to go do research down at the bottom of the ocean, and some weird things start happening as that's going on. And then another one following her spouse after she has come back, and her spouse is slowly, essentially morphing into or changing, disappearing, kind of turning into a jelly-like creature. She isn't able to spend time outside of the water. It really is a story focused on sort of the ways that you deal with a relationship that is irrevocably changed, and what happens when, even though you love someone, maybe the best decision is to let them go. It has to do with the way that people change based on the events that go on in their lives, and sometimes you aren't able to repair the relationships that you once had, because the person that you fell in love with doesn't really exist anymore. It's really kind of sad and melancholy, but it was a very interesting one. Again, magical realism elements, because there is a character who's literally like disintegrating in front of the other character. As is often the case, that's more a um, metaphor for the ways that the person that you once knew no longer existing, and realizing it as you come to terms with the things that are going on there. If you like weird, sort of creepy stories, because there is an element of, I want to say, like eldritch horror almost in the one timeline where they are under the ocean. And then the more, I would say, down to earth, but it is still a part where a person is like disintegrating in front of another person. More down to earth section discussing relationships and the way that we are. I know that I highlighted a bunch of stuff because there were really beautiful lines in the writing of that section. And it's another one that I recommend, especially if you like sort of weird queer fiction. It's one to add to your list if you haven't already. Storygraph told me that the next book on this list was actually the most popular book that I read this year, or at least when it comes to like people who shelved it on Storygraph itself, and that is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. That is, I sort of give the elevator pitch for that one of like Trans Mulan. It's a story where our main protagonist, it has multiple POVs, but the main protagonist and person behind the story is a young girl who's very early on, her brother and father are killed, and she decides to change her fate by taking on her brother's life. She goes to a monastery and becomes a monk, and then decides to, when that monastery is burned down, decides to join the war efforts in order to fight back an invading army that has been coming through the area. It also follows a bunch of other characters. It's interesting. I say trans Mulan. She always uses she, her for herself in her head, but is very uncomfortable with anybody actually perceiving her gender as thus, and doesn't really act as a woman would in this society or in our society. And thus her non-binary sort of gender is interesting. All the way up until the point where she eventually marries a woman. And I have the second book in this duology already purchased, but I haven't read it yet. But if you like Asian inspired fantasy where it's like very clearly like these are the Huns and this is China, even though we aren't actually saying that, it's just like Hun based fantasy Asian group, China based Asian fantasy group, Japanese based Asian fantasy group. Um, it might be interesting to you. If you want to see some interesting queer rep or gender roles, gender interplay happening, that one's also here and interesting, and I will be intrigued to see what happens in the next book, because the sort of reveal that happened at the end of this one was intriguing, and I want to see who comes out on top at the end of the whole series. The next book I gave 5 stars was One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. I know this is also on Gretchen's list of the best books that we read this year. This was the best nonfiction book that I read this year. It's very poignant, obviously. Omar Elikad is discussing in this one the relationship that specifically the West has with Palestine, and the ways that we can distance ourselves, and while saying that we represent freedom and fight for injustices, we will do the complete opposite and sort of talk ourselves out of supporting smaller groups, especially if they're in an unfavored minority. This feels very much similar to like They Called Us Enemy or Layla Leilami's Conditional Citizens, which I read a couple of years ago. So if you are interested in seeing somebody who's from the region discussing their view, they aren't currently there. They've lived in the US or Canada for most of their life. They're pretty far removed from that at this point, but they have the experience of sort of being this in between, like knowing what it's like in the region and also knowing what it's like here, and sort of holding a mirror up to Western society as a whole. We discussed in the review that we did together more of our thoughts on that. I think it's very important, and it's pretty short, so if you haven't picked it up, it's worth a read. But if you want to hear our more in-depth discussion about like why we both really enjoyed that, I recommend going and watching that video. The next book on my list is Automatic Noodle by Annalee Newitz. This is a short sci-fi novella following a group of robots who are trying to open up a noodle shop in a post-apocalyptic world. It's like very clearly an allegory for immigration and the way that immigrants are treated in our current society, as there's a lot of overlap of the ways in which the robots are treated as immigrants are currently treated. So it's a little on the nose. If that bothers you, it might be a problem. But I honestly, for how short that one was, I felt like there was a whole lot of heart, and those characters had so much life and interesting little quirks that I really loved. For something so short, I wasn't expecting like a whole lot, and it is a pretty simple plot. But I greatly enjoyed it, and at the time that I read it, it was like a really nice breather for sort of the things that I was reading around it. I enjoyed it. It's a good time. Is it gonna be breathtaking writing? Maybe not. But for like an enjoyable little sci-fi read, 5 stars from me. It was what I thought it was going to be, and maybe a little bit more than that as well. The last 2 books I read were both by Stephen Graham Jones, that I rated 5 stars. The first one was I Was a Teenage Slasher, and the second one was Buffalo Hunter Hunter. For me personally, if I had to say which one of those I liked better, I would say I Was a Teenage Slasher, but that's because I personally am a huge fan of slashers, so that genre just like suits my taste a little bit more. But I do feel like Buffalo Hunter Hunter would be more appealing to a wider audience. I Was a Teenage Slasher is very much a like slasher romp, even though it is a twist on the genre in that you are following the slasher, and it's also treating an entity like a slasher as sort of like a supernatural disease. Like it's something that this character gets from being infected with the blood of another character that is a slasher, and it's not something that they're actively choosing to do, but it is like the tropes are being pushed onto him with a certain amount of magic. I loved it. It was super fun. If you're a fan of slashers, it's definitely like worth looking into. It's not like over the top horror, but there are some like pretty gory depictions of things going on, because again, slashers are kind of known for the like huge death scenes. So if that's something you're not comfortable with, maybe don't pick up this one. It does have some gore going on with it, but it was a fun time for me. I loved every second of it. When you get to Buffalo Hunter Hunter, this one is very much more a slow atmospheric horror. There is some body horror elements to the second half, because there's a little bit of magic that goes on there, but for the most part, it's far less grotesque than I would say I Was a Teenage Slasher was, at least like in depictions, with the exception of like one really notable scene that I'm sure a bunch of people have spoken about. So if you are worried about it, you can sort of look into that yourself. That follows sort of 3 tiers of characters. There is a woman in modern times who has come across or been handed this journal that apparently belongs to her great-grandfather, I believe. There is the great-grandfather's journal that you are reading, and within that journal, he is recounting the oral history that a Indigenous man is telling him about how that Indigenous man became a vampire. And then all the way at the end, all of these sort of 3 stories will converge in a way that I found very satisfying, but I know not everybody loved. I was honestly surprised that this one didn't win the Goodreads Choice Awards for horror this year. I feel like it was like super buzzy when it came out, and it maintained that throughout the year. So that's intriguing from my end as someone who's been paying super close attention to the horror buzz this past year. But I personally highly recommend that one. So yeah, if you like a really great audiobook, because the audiobook on that one had 3 separate narrators for each of the sections, who I think all did a really great job. Highly recommend that one if you haven't picked it up. There are 4 books that I read this year that I think are going to be rated below a 3. The vast majority of my reading was somewhere in the 3 to 3.5 range, which I think is makes sense, right? That's average. This was a fine book. Like I would recommend it to you if you're interested, but it didn't like blow me away in any capacity. One of those doesn't come out until next year, so I'm not going to talk about it here. I don't want to like preemptively give negative buzz for something. Um, Gretchen and I did review it, and there will be a review of that one like after the release date. But again, we don't want to necessarily talk about that one as it was yet. So that'll be a surprise once it comes up. You can hear us talk about it there. Of the other 3, the first one that I read was Mated to the Monster. I read that for our reading roundtable where we were reading Monster Romance together, which is so sad for me because it was like my genre pick for that reading challenge and also for the roundtable. And I picked one off of my shelves that had been on a backlist shelf, but it turned out to not be the best. That follows a woman who accidentally summons her fated mate, and them trying to figure out how to send him back if that was the case, or to finalize the bond so that he can stay in the human realm, because if he isn't bonded to her, then it was illegal for him to be in the human realm and he would essentially be imprisoned forever for visiting there. There were a lot of issues with that one, not least of which was the additional story that was in the bind up edition that I had, where it was basically made known that because they needed to have sex in order to consummate the bond, the day that they had sex is apparently the only time where he 100% would definitely impregnate her, and he didn't tell her that. So she got impregnated in that moment and then finds out later. It was bad. So it's not one that I would recommend, unfortunately. Like, I do love a good monster romance, but this one didn't do it for me. It wasn't my favorite. No offense to this author. It just was not for me. The next one on the list, unfortunately, was another one of my picks for our reading challenge, which was Reservoir Witches by Dalia de la Cerda. I gave that one 2.5 stars, same with the last one. Aside from the last story, which both Gretchen and I loved, most of that we did not love. We did a full review of it. It is a collection of short stories that center around women in Mexico and their issues. Half of them are sort of interconnected stories that follow a group of characters that are all related to a woman who gets murdered by her boyfriend. There's issues of gang violence and poverty and all of the things that you would expect from a story that centers like the issues of women in Mexico. While we really appreciated what was trying to be said there, we felt like there were some issues with the translation. And I literally wanted to make sure I knew that that was the case before I said that out on the internet. So I bought the Spanish language version and read some of the stories in Spanish as well. I wish that I had liked more of it, but the last story is definitely worth it if you can get your hands on a copy of just that one. It's worth reading, I think. That one was like really the strongest and highly recommend that. And then the most disappointing read for me that I gave 2 stars, which I think is the lowest that I rated anything this year, was The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. I read this for my video where I was reading a bunch of the Women in Horror Goodreads Choice Award nominees of last year, of 2024, 2 years ago now, which I think Fable actually told me was my hottest take, because it's very highly rated and I gave it 2 stars. I think it is a me problem. Clearly it is, because a lot of people really love it, but I got frustrated by a couple of different things with that. It follows a young Korean girl whose father suddenly abandons their family. Once that happens, she's in college. She has a bunch of stressors that are on her. It's her first year of college. She's having a hard time maintaining her GPA. Her mom starts dating a white man who is kind of gross towards anybody who's Asian. And she at the same time starts having these dreams where she's obsessing over eating eyeballs, um, to the point where she starts killing people for their eyeballs. The thing that kind of bothered me about this one is that it's very much a quote-unquote good for her book, and that you're supposed to feel like vindicated in all of these kills that she's doing. And for me, I don't enjoy like the revelry in causing people harm. I understood the point that was trying to be made by the book and the discussion of the ways that men in general look at women, but even on top of that, the way that they look at Asian women, it's definitely worth like looking at and talking about. But I don't know that I can get behind a book that's like, so we should kill them all. It isn't fun for me. I don't enjoy that. It's interesting because as someone who enjoys horror, a lot of people will say, oh, do you enjoy viewing violence against people? The way that a lot of people struggle to, but I'm not a person who's reading that because I'm taking joy in the violence. It is more so that I like facing the violence in reality, reflected in these narratives. So yeah, this one definitely wasn't for me. It just wasn't to my own personal taste. If it was to you, no offense. Like, I totally understand like why people have that rage and that will to have the violence that's enacted on them reflected back onto the people who are doing it. I totally get it. Just isn't something that I enjoy. There were some other issues. If you want my full thoughts, I did a whole mini review of it in that video, that I think is more articulate than this one is coming out to be. I wound up talking about 10 books in total here, and then hinted at one that you'll have to wait until next year to hear more of our thoughts about. Because again, Gretchen and I both are going to talk about that one together, and we've already filmed that review. It is ready and waiting for you when the book comes out. If you have not watched Gretchen's like top and bottom of the year, please go watch that. We are getting our buddy reading challenge wrap up and our prompt announcement for next year together for you, so you have that to look forward to coming up as well. And I will be back. I think what I want to do next is talk about my fan fiction for the last year, because I didn't get to talk about it very much on the channel because I was actually reading a bunch of books that I could talk about for reading roundtables, and I didn't need to be like, I didn't read any books, so here are the fan fictions I read, because I still read like the equivalent of like 100 books in fan fiction last year. And I want to recommend some of my favorites that I found along the way. I hope you guys are having a lovely week. Have a happy new year, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.